The honourable member for Marlborough South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would say to the members across the way, now they already started about what do you know about the fisheries. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm elected by the people to represent them on all times, on all types of issues, Mr. Speaker. And you know, Mr. Speaker, we have people who are appointed to ministerial posts. We have a Minister of Justice. I don't think he's a lawyer. I don't think he's a judge. I don't think he was a former police officer. Maybe he watched Matlock or Night Court or something, I don't know. But, I mean, Mr. Speaker, we're all entitled to speak on all this legislation. So I would ask for the respect that I've given the members across the way. I haven't opened my mouth when they're up speaking. I would appreciate the same courtesy. Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, please to stand and speak to Bill 18, an act to amend the Fish Processing Licensing Board Act. And, Mr. Speaker, what's being proposed here, as we said here, Mr. Speaker, they're going to take Section 6 of the Fish Processing Licensing Board Act. Is going to be amended by adding after subsection 2 a clause which is going to be 2.1. That's going to say where the term of a member of the board expires, he or she continues to be a member until reappointed or replaced. Now, Mr. Speaker, basically what they're saying there, Mr. Speaker, is that instead of having a fixed term, and I believe I heard the member opposite talk about a 4-year fixed term, whereby once that term is over, they would simply have a process of reappointing somebody else. Basically, they're saying that they can kind of let it slide for a period of time for whatever reason. And there's nothing that says what that time is. I mean, you know, it doesn't say that, you know, it's going to be 4 years and 1 month, it's going to be 4 years and 6 months, it doesn't say it's going to be 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, whatever it is. Now, I'm sure the intent, obviously, I would hope, would be that it would only be for some unforeseen circumstance beyond the 4 years, that there was a period of time there that for some reason they couldn't get somebody or whatever, or they had somebody they were going to reappoint or to appoint to the board, but for some reason there was a slight delay and they wanted to have a little bit of wiggle room. And if that's the intent, which I assume it is, then I wouldn't have an issue with that per se, Mr. Speaker. But you know, Mr. Speaker, in terms of this appointment, though, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important, though, that no different with this board than any other board, and there are many, many boards which operate within government, at arm's length of government, in various departments of government. And I think when it comes to all of these boards, it is incumbent upon the department, it is incumbent upon the minister to ensure that we have people appointed to all the positions, to ensure, I would hope that there would be some level of knowledge or expertise perhaps in a particular area, to ensure that you know, that the people that are appointed to the board are, you know, there's no conflicts of interest or anything like that, and I'm sure that would be the process. So, you know, Mr. Speaker, if somebody is simply put there and there's no set mechanism, no set time to look at reappointing people, so on, I heard my colleague, I believe he referred to it, that the board is kind of put on autopilot, then, you know, sometimes I think that could lead to issues. I think it could possibly lead to complacency. You know, you could have somebody who may have gone on the board originally and they were very interested in serving on that board and so on, Mr. Speaker. They felt they had something to offer, and, you know, maybe they thought for a 4-year term would be good. Maybe after only a year or two they realized that they weren't really into it as much as they thought, or the interest wasn't there, and so on, and so sometimes people can get a little complacent and so on. Then you have issues, Mr. Speaker, about people, you know, if that were to happen, people not showing up to meetings and so on. Mr. Speaker, you know, we have a number of people within our province that work in Alberta, for just as an example. Work up in Fort McMurray or other parts of the country and so on, and they're away from home for periods of time. And perhaps somebody might have been appointed to the board, and originally there was no issue there, but then because of employment and so on, taking them away from the province, taking them away from things, you know, in their where they live, and family issues and personal issues, and certainly taking them away from being able to properly serve on this particular board. That could happen. There's people, obviously, you know, we could have deceased people. You know, we could have. So there's a whole host of issues, I guess, as to why somebody may have been appointed to a board, a particular board. In this particular, we're talking to this one, but it could be any board. And for any host of reasons, you know, perhaps they're not going to be available to serve at all, or they're going to be very limited in their ability to serve. Perhaps when they were appointed to the board originally, there was no conflict of interest, but now, you know, because they or a family member or somebody got involved in, you know, in the industry and so on, maybe that could have created a conflict of interest that wasn't there at the time when they were appointed and so on. So, you know, with all those reasons, I think it's important to ensure that when we appoint people to any board, including this particular board, that we have a process, a set of checks and balances when it comes to the appointments, when it comes to the terms of the appointments, and when it comes to reappointment. And even beyond the 4 years, I think there should be regular monitoring of any board, including this board, by the minister or by the minister's office, to ensure that, you know, even if there was a fixed term for 4 years, they should be monitoring those boards to ensure that the boards are meeting. They're meeting, you know, as often as they ought to be, that they're dealing with issues that are supposed to be dealt with, that they're keeping good records of the meetings, that they're serving the stakeholders that they were put in place to serve, and they're doing it properly. So to have a set of checks and balances, even within that 4-year term or 5-year term, whatever it is, in this case out here it's a 4-year term, I think that should be there as well. Because, Mr. Speaker, when we're talking about any committee, when we're talking about this particular committee, or when we're talking about any committee for that matter, Mr. Speaker, it's important that we have people there that are there with the best of intentions. It's important that we have people there that are doing the job that they're supposed to be doing, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the stakeholders that they were put in place to deal with. And when we talk about this particular committee, we're talking about...
Order, please! Order, please!
When we talk about this particular committee, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about a committee that has a mandate of reviewing fishing or fish processing licenses, and that could be looking for new processing licenses, or that could be looking to get fish processing license transferred from one facility to a different facility, perhaps from one company to another company, one community to another community, and so on. And you know, this is very important, obviously, to the industry. It's very important to the fishers. It's very important to the processing companies. It's very important to the people that are employed by the processing companies. It's very important to people who are employed as a result of spin-off from the fish processing companies. It's very important to the town or to the community in terms of tax base, in terms of employing its people, making the communities viable, the economic development, because in many of our rural towns, they depend solely on the fishery. and their life's blood is that particular fish processing facility. So therefore, the issues in terms of licensing, in terms of new licenses, transferred licenses, and so on, this is critical to the life of many communities in rural Newfoundland and Labrador. So this committee, while the, one can argue, and the government side might maybe argue, well, this is only a minor amendment, and it's not a large amendment, but the subject matter to which this amendment applies, that being the Fish Processing Licensing Board, is huge. It's huge to many communities in rural Newfoundland and Labrador in particular. So it's important to make sure that any piece of legislation that we review that has any impact on the fishery, and hence any impact on all of our many of our rural communities, that we give it the due diligence that it deserves, that everybody has some input, that we ask some questions, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Not a thing wrong with the world. That's why oppositions exist. They exist to ask questions, to hold government's feet to the fire, to debate legislation, to bring forth new ideas, and so on, so that we make sure collectively that we have the best possible piece of legislation for the stakeholders involved. And the stakeholders involved in this particular case are fish processors, fishers, and as I said, spin-off businesses, towns, communities, workers, and so on. So it has a huge impact. So that's why we ask some of these questions. Now, Mr. Speaker, the other amendment here talks about the required number of meetings. And again, it was 6 was a minimum, and now we're going down to 2 as a minimum. And again, I understand as it's written here, that there's nothing to say they can't have more than 2. And I believe the previous speaker, which was yourself, Mr. Speaker, indicated that they can have more than 2, and that's fine. But again, when you then look at the fact that you have committees, and you have committees here that we have issues here around the committees, as I outlined, the fact that there's not necessarily checks and balances with the committees to make sure who's on the committee, if they're if they're not in the conflict of interest, if someone is not deceased that was born to the committee, and so on. Without that monitoring all of those people, then how do we ensure that those people are going to meet more than twice if it's required that they meet more than twice? Now, hopefully they would. Hopefully they would. And but it is important to do due diligence to make sure that they do, because the fishing industry is seasonal, as we know. It's the fishing industry. It is seasonal for different species, and so on, that you fish in certain areas at certain times that you fish certain species, certain areas, certain times of the year. And if you have somebody who is going to apply for a license, or they're going to apply to have a license transferred and so on, and of course we know quotas can change, and the value of product can change, and so on, and the dollar can change, and all that stuff can have an impact on whether or not it's viable to process a certain species in a certain area, in a certain plant, and so on. So as these things evolve, it's important that particular committee is able to react to that request in a timely fashion. because it's all about timing. Like in any business, you know, you got to strike when the iron is hot. In this case, you have a limited window, time, area, and so on to do this. So it's important that when you determine that there's an opportunity in the particular fishery, in a particular area, for a new license or for a transferred license and so on, that once you determine that, you need to be able to go to this board, and that board needs to be able to deal with that matter in a timely fashion and get the recommendations to the minister in a timely fashion so that the minister can make a decision which is going to have a positive, hopefully a positive impact on that particular processor. It's going to have a positive impact on the workers in that facility, and it's going to have a positive impact on the community as a whole. Now, Mr. Speaker, the other point I wanted to raise here, I'm wondering about consultations. I'm wondering about consultations with the stakeholders. Mr. Speaker, like any piece of legislation, and perhaps the Minister will address this when we get to Committee of the Whole, Mr. Speaker, but I would hope, Mr. Speaker, that there was consultation done on this piece of legislation, as I would hope there would be consultation done on any piece of legislation going through this House, but in this case, with fishers, with processors, with current and past board members, with experts in the fishery, with the communities, with the general public, and other experts in the industry, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important that those consultations take place. I hope they have, and hopefully the Minister will address that when he gets up to close debate, or perhaps even in committee, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, that pretty much concludes the points that I wanted to make on this particular bill, Mr. Speaker. Overall, I think the intent, once again, and we've seen this in other bills, other pieces of legislation that we have debated here in the House, and I'm sure others we will debate. I think that perhaps the intent is good, but maybe there needs to be, it needs to be tightened up a little bit. And I heard a number of suggestions from my colleague here from the Straits, White Bay North, who certainly does have a lot of fishing processing facilities in his particular district. And he made a lot of very valid points. I thought he did. And Mr. Speaker, I hope that the Minister is taking these issues into account. I hope the Minister is listening to what my colleague has had to say, and hopefully we will have the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to debate this even further as time goes on, and I'm certainly prepared to stand on my feet again if that's the way they want it over on the other side, and we can get in committee and we can talk about this and we can debate it all night long, and I can ask questions, and I got no problem doing that. And perhaps even the member from Cape St. Francis, he might get up because he seems to be a real expert himself and in the fishery. You know, seems to be an expert. He's having an awful lot to say there, and I'd love to hear some of his expert knowledge.
I remind the honourable member to address the chair and the bill, please.
Yes, sorry, Mr. Speaker, but I certainly would like to hear some of his expert knowledge come across, because I'm sure there's a lot that I could learn from him about the fishery, and I am very willing to learn from him, or anybody who has any information to offer, constructive information to this debate. I want to hear it, because if I'm going to...
The honourable member from St. Francis on a point of order.
know the honourable member that I know a whole lot more about fishery than he does. I have a son and a brother on the water today at the crab fishery, by the way, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, and I have a number of family members of my own and my wife's family and friends and so on who are likewise involved in the fishery. So I mean, if being an expert in the fishery means that you got some family member that goes out and fishes, well, I guess we're all experts here because we're all Newfoundlanders. Anyways, Mr. Speaker, as I was saying,
I remind the honourable member his time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to speaking to